What if just 3 hours could destroy everything you thought was unbreakable? Tonight's story is not just about a mistake. It's about betrayal, discovery, and the quiet kind of revenge that leaves scars deeper than shouting ever could. This is the story of a suburban marriage that looked perfect on the outside, but inside, secrets were waiting to explode. Stay with me, because what happens in the end will leave you questioning trust, loyalty, and the price of silence. You're watching Cheating Stories 7, where every story reminds us that betrayal always comes with consequences. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice makes this community stronger. Now, let's step together into the chilling tale. 3 hours of betrayal destroyed everything. My husband found out the truth. Morning arrived in quiet layers across the north end of Seattle. Gulls skimmed the inlet, a bus sighed at the corner, and the thermostat clicked softly as the house woke. Daniel set a mug by my elbow, handle turned to the right, the way he always remembered. The smell of dark roast opened the day like a small promise. Before 8, we rarely spoke. We moved in rhythm. He checked the piano bench for his notebook while I watered the basil on the sill. The kitchen light turned ordinary things, dish rack, fruit bowl, into order. By the hallway mirror, he nodded his tie, head tipped as if listening for a note only he could hear. "Early or late till next Thursday?" he asked. "Early," I said, "then the lake, the birches." He smiled with his whole face, not just his mouth, and something unknotted beneath my ribs. Strangers respected him. Friends admired him. At home, he was gentle in ways no audience would notice. Our life wasn't showy, it was steady. It held. I had learned how to breathe inside that steadiness. Before Daniel, my days were whether bright, violent, fast enough to mistake adrenaline for love. With him, the forecast changed. We built habits that turned promise into structure. Phones face down at dinner, a walk after Wednesday rain, a rule about telling the truth even when it sounded dull. Some nights he played slow blues, and the house seemed to lean closer to listen. We spoke of the future as if it had already stepped inside and set down its bags. And yet an old accent lingered in my thoughts. 2 blocks over, a motorcycle coughed to life, and a nerve under my skin answered before my mind could translate. A bar song from a decade ago drifted from a passing car, and my heart took one fast step in the wrong direction. Discipline and certainty were not native tongues for me. I spoke them now with care, but the mouth remembered other grammars. I told myself this was normal. Healed bones complain in rain. Wanting quiet does not erase the body's memory of fire. The mail slid through the slot while the kettle sang. I opened envelopes without looking, letting the day try to settle around us. One was hand-addressed in a slanted, tidy script. No return name, no logo. The paper smelled faintly of detergent, like a shirt that had hung too long to dry. I opened it with a thumbnail as I crossed the kitchen, expecting a save the date or a neighbor's thank you. Inside lay a single square photograph, the glossy kind you print at a drugstore kiosk when you're trying to prove something to yourself. A parking lot at summer dusk. A leaning streetlight, sky the color of warmed steel. In the foreground stood a woman with my hair, my profile, my unguarded mouth. A man's hand rested at her waist, his face out of frame, but I knew his jaw by the shadow of it. The picture carried scent, cheap beer, motor oil, hot asphalt after a day of heat. My first instinct was to call it nostalgia. My second was to run water over it until the ink surrendered and the past unraveled grain by grain. For a heartbeat, I pretended it was mine from another life, a relic I had failed to burn. But the angle was wrong, the timing wrong, the shirt I was wearing one I had donated before we moved. Whoever took this stood close enough to hear the sound a mouth makes leaving another mouth. Whoever mailed it knew where I lived now. Heat gathered beneath my ribs, not desire, not fear, something more like a locked room opening without permission. The kettle quieted. The house listened. I slid the photo back into the envelope and buried it in the recycling beneath a sleeve from Daniel's guitar strings and a stack of circulars, as if paper could muffle a past that still breathed. The lid settled with a hush that sounded like a pact. In the hall, Daniel cleared his throat, a ritual that had never frightened me until this second. "Want me to take the mail?" he asked. "Handled," I said, my voice almost steady. He kissed my hairline. His tenderness landed exactly where it always had. Somehow that was what made me dizzy. All afternoon, the envelope burned through cardboard and ink. I moved a chair 2 inches left, then 2 inches back. I wiped the counter twice and pretended it needed both passes. I answered emails with perfect punctuation, like a woman with nothing to hide. Still, the picture superimposed itself on ordinary surfaces: a flash in the stainless fridge, a ghost in the black microwave door, a thin shadow across the sink. I tried to believe in the mercy of forgetting. Memory had other plans. Evening arrived on schedule. Daniel brought takeout from the Thai place that remembered our names and knew I liked extra limes. We ate on counter stools with our knees almost touching, talking about the clinic tour, the friend who finally adopted, the one who could not carry past 12 weeks. His steadiness was a kindness so complete it became a mirror. In it I saw the person I promised to be. I heard myself say when, not if, and for a moment I believed I had outrun every fire. After dinner he tuned the guitar he was building for a friend while I took the recycling to the curb. The envelope waited where I had hidden it, patient as a trap. I drew it out and looked once more, not to memorize, but to decide. The photo proved the past knew my address. It was not prophecy unless I wrote it. I tore it in half, then quarters, then eighths. The sound was smaller than I hoped. The pieces fit too easily in my hand. I scattered them like dull confetti and pressed the lid until the hinge clicked. In bed, the window showed a thin comma of moon. Daniel's breathing steadied. I thought of the birches at the lake, the clinic brochure on the fridge, the loaf rising for morning. Perfect things do not break because they are fragile. They break because someone sets them down too quickly. I decided to carry carefully. 2 blocks over, a motorcycle coughed and faded. I let the sound pass like whether I did not need to chase. For now the house held. For now I did too. Ryan Cole was gasoline wherever he went. If Daniel was the steady rhythm of a metronome, Ryan had always been a drumline breaking tempo. Loud, insistent, impossible to ignore. Emily remembered him not in full sentences, but in flashes of sensation. The heat of his hand gripping hers too tightly on the back of a Harley, the metallic taste of whiskey and a midnight kiss, the ache in her chest from screaming matches that ended in apologies half-meant. Nights with Ryan felt like cliff edges, dizzying, dangerous, thrilling, and mornings were fallout, the silence after explosions. She told herself she had left all that behind, that the wreckage of their marriage was buried deep under the soil of better choices. And yet memory does not obey logic. Ryan had been magnetic and ruinous in the same breath, capable of dragging her into a bar fight at midnight and then holding her as though she were porcelain by dawn. He was the kind of man who lied without blinking, borrowed money he never intended to repay, wore leather like a second skin, and walked into rooms as if rules were for other people. She hated that part of him. She loved it too. The day she packed her car and drove away, she told herself she was done bracing for impact, done with the cycle of chaos and hollow reconciliations. Meeting Daniel afterward had felt like oxygen arriving late but desperately needed, like lungs unclenching. Daniel never made her feel small, never left her wondering if he would return, never turned her love into a contest. Yet Ryan still occupied a corner of her mind Daniel could never reach, a place where danger glowed neon, where every broken rule felt like freedom. She named that corner a youthful mistake, a phase she had outgrown. But her body remembered acceleration, the way wind scalded her cheeks when Ryan opened the throttle and she clung tighter instead of letting go. In the guest room's high closet sat a box she had not touched in years, photos curled at the edges, bracelets from rallies, a denim jacket that still smelled faintly of smoke. She told herself it was clutter waiting to be sorted. But she knew the truth. It was a reliquary for the part of her she pretended no longer existed. When the anonymous photograph arrived in the mail, she tried to ignore the chill it sent crawling down her spine. A kiss in a parking lot, captured years ago, mailed now without explanation. It made the past feel suddenly present tense again. She told no one, not Daniel, not even her closest friend. She slipped the picture under junk mail in the recycling bin and pressed the lid until it clicked shut, as though secrecy could smother memory. But memory had its own engine. A week later, her phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize. The message used her maiden name, a name almost no one spoke anymore. Just 5 words, "You still crave what you fear." It read like a dare. Her fingers trembled as she deleted it, but the words burned through the screen into her chest. That night, Daniel played a slow blues progression on the piano, shoulders relaxed, voice humming beneath his breath. Emily poured wine, smiled in the right places, pretended the melody steadied her. But even with Daniel's music filling the house, she could feel it, the faint draft under the door carrying the smell of motor oil and smoke. Ryan, or the ghost of him, was back in her orbit, and she knew ghosts rarely stayed quiet. The water outside the hotel shimmered like poured metal, ferries threading light across the harbor. Inside, chandeliers floated like small moons, and the air smelled of lilies and expensive confidence. Daniel moved through the crowd with an ease that belonged to him, firm handshakes, a story that made a donor laugh, a quiet promise to follow up on a school's laptop program. He was at his best when no one was watching, but even here, being watched, he stayed the same. Before the program director called him over, he brushed a kiss against my temple, leaving me with a flute of champagne and the warm ghost of his lips. I was good at this world, too, remembering names, summarizing causes, wearing shoes that would not betray me. I asked questions that let people talk about themselves and left them feeling seen. The band shifted into something velvet and mid-tempo. I rehearsed a line about last year's impact report when static rippled the silk room. Leather among tuxedos. Ryan stood at the far bar like a dare dressed as a man. He should not have belonged here, yet somehow he did. He grinned when he saw me, the grin that once felt like fate choosing me and later felt like a warning label. He waited until the circle around me dissolved, then drifted closer, a storm pretending to be weather. "Domestic life," he said lightly, still allergic to speed. He smelled like soap, not whiskey, and that threw me. He nodded at my ring. "Sunday still for laundry." His small talk was a map where every turn led to a landmine disguised as a memory. "I didn't know you were invited," I said, because it was easier than asking why he looked soberly handsome under chandelier light. "Plus one of a donor," he answered. "Plus me." The band pulled a slow standard out of the air, setting it between us like a stage. I felt the old impulse to step closer to the edge of a thing just to see if it was a cliff. I stayed where I was. "You look well," he said, and for once there was no edge on it. Gentleness in his mouth was more dangerous than cruelty. I knew how to brace for cruelty. The balcony doors breathed cold when I pushed through them. The city glowed expensive and remote, warmth a premium one had to pay to approach. Ryan followed, because of course he did. "I'm sober," he said to the night, not to me. "Part-time mechanic, part-time security at a warehouse that never sleeps, still riding, still alive." Turned his face to the wind like it might stamp him with approval. "You," he added softly, and I felt how much he already knew. I waited for the bait, the trap disguised as nostalgia. Instead he said, almost kind, "Some people are built for quiet. You could be one." The compliment landed like velvet teeth. "I am fine," I said, the sentence so small against the water I almost lost it. He leaned on the rail. "That clinic," he said casually, "good choice. Heard the success rates are solid." The word clinic was a wire pulled too tight. My laugh came out on cue and sounded rented. "What clinic?" His eyes flicked to mine, then away, as if to be merciful. "The brochure in your glove box." The floor of my body dropped a fraction. The night smelled metallic. Someone had eyes where I was supposed to be alone. I reached for a fence but came up empty. "You always were a storyteller," I said. "Tell a new one." He shrugged. "I'm telling this one to leave it alone." Between his fingers, a business card appeared. He set it on the balcony rail like a glass he didn't plan to refill. "No pressure, Em." He said my old name without looking at me. I couldn't tell if it was nostalgia or diagnosis. I did not touch the card. I did not touch him. Inside, the song changed. Laughter rose like a tide. Wind lifted the corner of the card and pressed it flat again. It would have been so easy to slide it into my clutch and call it curiosity. I left it sitting there, a dare I refused. Back in the ballroom, the room felt 2 degrees warmer and 1 inch closer to the skin. I found Daniel near the dessert table, making a donor laugh without becoming the punchline. He looked at me the way he always had, present, unforced. That steadiness steadied me. He folded my empty glass into his hand and held mine in return. Everything in me wanted to collapse into that grip, to let it hold the whole weight of me. I told him the band was excellent. I told him the keynote was better than last year's. I did not tell him the city now had corners with Ryan's name etched into them. When we said our goodnights and stepped into the cold, the harbor breathed fog over the walkway. The valet handed me my clutch. It felt heavier than before. In the back seat, beneath the blanket we kept for late-night movies in the park, there was a brochure with tabbed pages, timing, success rates, insurance. I imagined a stranger's hand opening my glove box. I imagined Ryan's. Neither image fit cleanly. We drove home with the heater humming, Daniel's hand warm over mine. Later in the kitchen light, I opened my clutch to find a square of cardstock I had not picked up. No logo, just a number. Letterpress edges expensive, as if someone tried to make gravity out of paper. I stared until the edges blurred. I pictured the balcony rail, my empty hand, the wind. I pictured a room where someone moved things when no one was looking, just to see who noticed. I slid the card beneath a drawer liner, as if thin wood could shield me from paper. In bed, Daniel's breathing evened. I stared at the ceiling and felt the draft under the door finally step into the room. Emily told Daniel she needed to swing by the boutique to exchange a dress. Her voice was even, almost casual. She timed the lie down to the minute, where she would park, how long it should take, the exact excuses if traffic came up. Instead, she turned onto a dim side street 3 blocks from Ryan's loft, as if the extra distance could wash her clean before she arrived. The stairwell smelled of oil, cigarette ash, and rusted metal. Grit clung to her silk blouse as if sin itself had a scent. For the first 15 minutes inside Ryan's apartment, adrenaline convinced her she was alive again. It wasn't love, not even desire. It was the ghost of a pulse she thought she had buried. His hands were reckless, his voice still whiskey rough, though he swore he was sober. The intensity consumed her, a fire so fast it left only smoke. But after those fleeting minutes, heat curdled into something heavier. Each second stretched, filling with guilt, disgust, the realization that she was trading years of stability for hours that felt like erosion rather than passion. She saw herself from above, like a stranger in the room, and hated the reflection. When she dressed again, Ryan said her name like a lullaby, softer than she remembered. That gentleness wounded her more than violence ever had. Outside, rain needled her face, sharp as if the sky itself was scolding her. Behind the wheel, both hands clenched white on the steering wheel, she whispered lines of confession, then abandoned them because honesty demanded a price she was not prepared to pay. Her car dome light flickered as she deleted text messages, wiped her map's history, rehearsed the lie. She even imagined fingerprints left behind on Ryan's balcony rail and scrubbed them away in memory, as though shame could be erased like smudges on glass. She drove home in silence. The garage light glowed warm. Daniel was sanding the neck of a guitar, cedar dust haloing his hair. He smelled of patience and calm, humming absently to himself. He didn't ask why she was late. He didn't notice, or chose not to notice, the faint bruise forming along her shoulder where Ryan's grip had been too tight. Or if he did notice, he filed it away behind trust. Emily showered until the water ran cold. She told herself it was over, that the worst had passed. Yet in the fogged bathroom mirror, her reflection didn't look cleansed. It looked fractured, and she realized betrayal didn't end when a door closed. It began when you pretended nothing had happened. Down in the garage, Daniel's sanding rasped steady against wood. He was a man who noticed more than he ever let on. The aftermath was not fireworks, but gravity. Life folded back into its routines, yet every gesture felt weighted. One morning, Daniel made eggs, sliding the plate toward Emily with the same practiced ease as always. He brought her coffee the way she liked, 2 sugars, no cream, and kissed her hairline before sitting down with the paper. His gentleness was unchanged. That constancy terrified her more than any accusation could. Suspicion she might have argued with, but tenderness was an interrogation without words, forcing her to fill the silence with guilt. He asked lightly about the dress exchange. Emily answered quickly, recalling a detail she had invented: a sales clerk with red nails, slow at the register. Daniel nodded, tucking the fact somewhere behind his eyes. His gaze lingered a fraction longer than usual, like a lawyer filing evidence, patient and precise, waiting for corroboration. The house itself began to feel alive, as though deputized. The smart lock chimed whenever the door opened, keeping its own private log. The thermostat recorded patterns of absence and return. Even the garage camera, a feature Daniel had installed last year for convenience, kept a thumbnail archive she had never thought to check. At 4 a.m., she lay awake, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling as if microphones might be hidden in the plaster. Her mind circled back to the charity gala, to Ryan leaning close on the balcony, whispering about the fertility clinic brochure hidden in her glove box. How had he known? Who had fed him that detail? The anonymous photograph returned to her mind as well, the tidy, slanted script, the faint smell of detergent. Emily checked the blinds compulsively, scanning the street for any car idling too long. Even shadows felt like witnesses. Days passed measured in flinches. She rehearsed normalcy, smile when Daniel entered, laugh at the right pauses, pour wine as though nothing had cracked. But beneath it all ran a current of dread, the knowledge that secrets leak, that lies rot in the foundation of even the quietest homes. One afternoon, she found a courier slip on the console of Daniel's car. The package had been addressed to his office. The sender's name was blank. The contents listed simply, one USB drive. Her hands trembled so hard she nearly tore the slip in half. She could not open what she could not find, but instinct told her the drive carried her ruin. Proof compressed into megabytes. That evening, Daniel mentioned it casually, as if testing her pulse. He said the nonprofit board had requested a security review, accounting discrepancies around last year's silent auction. His smile was wry, his tone easy, but Emily felt the floor tilt beneath her. Accounting discrepancies could mean nothing, or everything. The words security review hung in the air like a storm warning. She nodded, careful to keep her face neutral, careful not to let her voice shake. But her mind was already flooding, a basement unable to absorb another storm. The house listened. The street watched. Daniel filed truths piece by piece, and Emily realized silence was not safety. Silence was surveillance. One day soon, she knew, silence would speak. Daniel began not with accusations, but with pebbles, small, almost harmless questions dropped into the quiet. Which mall was it again? He asked over dinner, tone mild, fork moving steadily. Northgate, Emily answered too quickly. He waited, then asked, which store? Bloom, no Belmore. The name faltered. A minute later, she corrected herself. Sorry, Bloomridge. The correction sounded flat, rehearsed even to her own ears. He nodded slowly, as though marking a tally. Did you validate parking? The question was casual, but it split her pulse. Yes. Then, realizing the slip, she added, actually, no, I paid cash, small lot, they don't validate. The lies stacked one on top of another, a teetering scaffolding built in panic. He asked to see the dress she supposedly exchanged. She said it was being altered. He asked for the receipt. She insisted she had paid cash. Each excuse became flimsier than the last, and she could feel the structure wobbling under its own weight. Finally, he laid the sharpest stone down gently. Can you give me your Google login? I just want to find that warranty receipt for the mixer from last month. The request froze her, too precise, too logical to refuse. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Daniel watched her face go still, the silence stretching longer than any answer could bear. She broke first. You don't trust me. The words burst too loud, ricocheting off the walls, sharp enough that the neighbors might hear. Her voice carried panic disguised as anger. Almost immediately, she backpedaled. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean that." The apology collapsed on itself until he had already learned to read. He didn't fight, he didn't press. He simply touched her wrist, thumb circling softly, and said, "We can do this gently or honestly. Your choice." She swallowed hard and offered a password. Wrong. Daniel didn't even test it. He nodded once, set the conversation down like a book half-read, and retreated to the garage. The rasp of sandpaper against cedar began again, his ritual when deciding which truths to leave unspoken. The silence was worse than shouting. It meant he was building something in his mind, patient, methodical. She imagined him stacking her lies the way he stacked guitar parts, layer by layer, fitting perfectly, waiting for the day the whole instrument would sing. Later that night, Emily unlocked her phone to find another message from the unknown number. 3 hours, 3 lies, 3 losses. Her breath caught. She blocked the number, powered down the phone, shoved it under a pillow, but the words hummed inside her skull long after the screen went dark. The vibration was no longer from the phone, it was the truth itself, buzzing, insistent, demanding to be heard. And for the first time, she realized Daniel didn't need to chase her lies. All he had to do was wait. Lies rot on their own. Truth did not crash through the door. It seeped in, quiet and orderly, documented piece by piece. Daniel didn't storm, didn't accuse. He consulted. His attorney forwarded him data no marriage could survive. Smart lock logs showing the precise hour Emily left and returned. The garage camera's plate scanned 3 blocks from Ryan's loft. The time-stamped entry into a downtown parking garage she had never mentioned. None of it shouted betrayal, but together the fragments formed a net no denial could slip through. Emily woke the next morning to an uncanny quiet. Daniel's side of the bed was already cold, already made. The kitchen looked staged, the coffee pot cleaned, no trace of breakfast. On the counter rested a folded page, his handwriting neat, deliberate, free of venom. "Emily, I loved you as fully as I knew how, but I will not spend my life competing with ghosts you choose to keep alive. My attorney will be in touch. Take care of yourself." No accusation, no curse, just finality that made it unbearable. Beside the note sat a box taped shut, her keepsakes. Photographs, trinkets, the glass snow globe from their trip to Vancouver, packed carefully as if he wanted to preserve her story even as he removed himself from it. But near the door stood another box, unopened. Inside was a small velvet case containing a ring, not flashy but thoughtful, chosen to mark the new chapter they had been planning after the fertility clinic tour. He had intended to surprise her on the very night she claimed she was late shopping. Emily's knees folded. She lowered herself onto the kitchen floor, clutching the note, then the box, sobbing without sound, her chest hollowing with each breath. The house seemed to exhale around her, not listening anymore, but closing in. She called him. No answer. She texted, paragraphs condensing into desperate single words. "Please, wait, listen." She emailed, pleaded, bargained with silence. Nothing returned. 2 days later, movers arrived. Daniel directed them quietly, voice even, eyes avoiding hers. They carried boxes of books, suits, the guitar case. When the truck door closed, she noticed what remained. The piano was still in the living room, unmoved. For a fragile moment, she mistook it for hope, a promise he might return for the music. But then her gaze fell on the bench, empty. The sheet music that once rested there was gone. He had taken the songs, leaving only the shell. Emily sat before the silent instrument, pressing a key that answered with nothing but air. The message arrived just after midnight when silence weighed heavier than daylight. Emily's phone vibrated once, casting a thin glow across the bedroom ceiling. Ryan's number. A single sentence, a link, and a dollar figure. The link opened to a cloud folder, grainy audio of her laughing in a stairwell, a still frame from a security camera showing her blurred outline entering his building. Evidence that would scorch any denial. His caption was blunt. "I want money, not trouble. If Daniel pays, no one needs to suffer." Her stomach twisted. Daniel would never pay a blackmailer. His pride ran deeper than his generosity. And Emily herself had little access to funds now. By morning, she decided on her own reckless fix: meet Ryan, buy silence with whatever scraps she could gather, then bury the rest. She drove to a parking lot behind a shuttered diner, headlights sweeping across cracked asphalt. The hour smelled of fryer oil and wet leaves. A sedan waited in the dark, but the figure who stepped out was not Ryan. She was tall, trench coat unbuttoned, hair tied back with the kind of precision expected in boardrooms. The woman introduced herself with a card: Mara Whitlow, licensed investigator. Emily's first instinct was to run, but her shoes rooted her in place. Mara handed her a folder, not a threat. Inside lay a non-disclosure draft, precise legalese, numbers on the last page that made Emily's head spin. Severance for silence. "You've been watched," Mara said, tone flat, professional. No cruelty, only business. She spoke of the clinic, the anonymous USB, the gala night. Each word clicked like tumblers in a lock. Emily's breath shortened as she realized the balcony card had never been Ryan's trick. It was Mara's, slipped into her clutch to see if she would reach for the flame. The ground tilted. "Daniel retained me months ago," Mara continued. "Not for you. A non-profit client suspected bid rigging. The contractor in question, Ryan Cole. Charity fraud, kickbacks, security contracts siphoned." Mara explained that if Ryan tried to blackmail anyone, a full dossier would go straight to the state attorney general. His leverage was already collapsing into his own trap. Emily's hands shook as she held the folder. Mara told her the divorce would be quiet, surgical, if she kept her mouth shut. But if she and Ryan stirred noise, the fallout would be public, merciless. The parking lot wind carried the faint growl of a motorcycle 2 streets away. Emily wondered if Ryan waited in the shadows, watching his old chaos get devoured by Daniel's precision. She drove home with white knuckles on the wheel. For the first time, she understood the game was no longer about passion or guilt. It was about who wrote the record. The asphalt behind her felt like it had opinions, and none of them were kind. Daniel never raised his voice, never slammed doors, never cursed. His form of anger had always been administrative. Months earlier, during a dinner with friends, a story of infidelity had come up. Someone's cousin had lost half a business to a cheating spouse, the fallout both financial and humiliating. Daniel had returned home thoughtful, not accusatory. A week later, he suggested a post-nuptial agreement. "It's not about us," he had said then, calm as rain. "It's about preparation, like insurance." Emily had agreed, half out of trust, half out of wanting to prove she had nothing to hide. They signed it over glasses of red wine, laughing at the oddness of drafting contingencies in a life they thought unshakable. Now, in her attorney's office, the document was no longer theoretical. The clauses read with surgical precision. A compensation schedule that kicked in without blame, but also a fidelity-triggered carve-out that shifted distribution. Emily's assets remained intact, but the house, the investments, even part of her retirement tilted toward Daniel. Enough for her to survive, but not enough to be cushioned. Daniel declined to speak with her directly. His messages traveled through counsel, stripped of warmth, stripped even of disdain, pure logistics. Then came the detail that stunned her. Daniel had instructed that his share of the house sale proceeds, what should have been his new beginning, be donated entirely to the tech literacy nonprofit where he volunteered. On paper, the act read like charity, but to Emily it felt like a message carved into stone. "I will not build anything new on ruins you helped burn. Instead, I'll turn the rubble into shelter for someone else." Her shame doubled, not by rage, but by the elegance of his withdrawal. And Ryan, always Ryan, threaded back into the picture. Emily learned what the USB had truly contained. Not a smoking gun of her betrayal, but Mara's footage of Ryan weeks before the gala, soliciting donations on behalf of the non-profit for a so-called security sponsorship. Every dollar had gone into his pocket. The evidence was airtight. The folder Daniel built was never sharpened for Emily's humiliation. It had been designed as a shield angled outward to protect the non-profit and to crush Ryan if he made noise. The revenge was not theatrical. It was structural. It looked like paperwork, like donation receipts, like filings at the county clerk's office. No shouting, no threats, just a quiet redirection of power. Emily sat alone with the signed documents in her lap, realizing Daniel's vengeance did not need spectacle. He had rewritten the terms of her life with ink and signatures, leaving her with survival but no comfort, history but no future. The silence that followed was not absence. It was design. The courthouse smelled of varnish and anxiety. Emily smoothed her skirt with trembling hands, pretending the gesture was composure. Daniel sat a few rows away, posture impeccable, expression unreadable. He greeted clerks with quiet dignity, the kind that made her ache. His presence was an indictment without words. In the hallway before the hearing, Ryan appeared like a bad omen. His leather jacket was frayed, his stubble weeks overdue, and his eyes burned with old grudges. He leaned close enough for her to smell whiskey that hadn't touched a glass in hours but still clung to his skin. "You don't have to lose everything," he hissed. "I can fix this if you cooperate, say the right things, forget Daniel, we've still got fire." Emily recoiled. His version of salvation was another trap, one she knew would drag her deeper under. Before she could answer, Mara stepped into view, phone angled casually, her presence deliberate. Ryan retreated, muttering curses about loyalty and debt. Inside the courtroom, betrayal took a new form. Lee sat in the back row, eyes fixed anywhere but Emily's. A friend once trusted with secrets, clinic visits, late-night doubts, now revealed as a source. Mara confirmed later what Emily already suspected. Lee had been feeding Ryan scraps for cash, a photo of Emily's car outside the clinic, a copy of the fertility brochure left in a tote, even a time-stamped image of her license plate after the gala. Each breadcrumb handed over not out of malice, but for money. On the record, Daniel was polished steel. His testimony was factual, never cruel. He acknowledged the marriage with respect, acknowledged Emily with courtesy, but withheld warmth. He did not seek punishment, he sought conclusion. Off the record, his attorney filed a stipulation, a no-contact clause binding Emily and Ryan apart forever. Then came the pivot Emily hadn't foreseen. The charity dossier, the one Ryan tried to weaponize, landed in the hands of the Foundation's counsel. A detective arrived, quiet and professional, collecting statements at the periphery. The fraud trail was too clean, too damning to ignore. Ryan's time was numbered. That night, Lee texted Emily 3 short sentences, no punctuation. "I'm sorry. I needed the money. Please don't hate me." It read less like remorse and more like acknowledgement of a transaction completed. Emily stared at it until her vision blurred, then deleted it. 2 weeks later, Ryan was arrested. Not for her, not for the affair, not for the 3 hours that ruined everything, but for charity, fraud, embezzlement, a list of charges long enough to drown a man. Emily felt a twisted relief. The chaos of his orbit was finally pulled away by gravity stronger than her weakness. Yet the relief curdled into nausea, because she knew none of this had been random. From the anonymous envelope to the gala to the courtroom, her downfall had begun the moment she answered a ghost with a living body. The choices were hers. The consequences, too. The test strip was so small it felt absurd that it could decide the shape of a lifetime. Emily stared until the lines blurred. 2 lines, a possibility, a threat, a whisper of continuity. Her body trembled not from joy but from the cruel calculus of timing. Whose child? What truth? What disaster? She made an appointment, waiting in silence among strangers with hope written on their faces. The doctor's words came clinical, merciless in their calm. A chemical pregnancy, the life never rooted. A beginning that ended before it could even be named. Emily walked home in a fog, carrying both devastation and clarity. The devastation was obvious, raw grief, unacknowledged by anyone but her. The clarity cut deeper. She realized she had never wanted a child to prove fertility, or to anchor Ryan, or to bargain with Daniel. She had only ever wanted a child with Daniel, within the safety of his steady hands and quiet mornings. That future was now a sealed door with no key. In the days that followed, she wrote a letter she never intended to send. In it, she narrated a phantom life, Daniel teaching a child to ride a bike, clapping as small wheels wobbled down the sidewalk. Sunday morning sticky with pancake batter, a tiny guitar balanced on small knees while he guided careful fingers over strings. A life imagined, drafted, and now buried in ink. She folded the pages, then tore them into confetti. Ryan's name lingered in her contacts like a stain. One night, she deleted the number, then dug deeper. A shoebox of photos, Harley's, motel rooms, blurry kisses, emerged from the back of her closet. She hesitated once before striking a match in the kitchen sink. Flames licked glossy paper, smoke clawed the air. The fire alarm screamed, neighbors banged on the wall, but she let the images curl and blacken until nothing was left but ash that reeked of metal and regret. The stench clung to her apartment for days, as though memory itself refused eviction. When the divorce decree arrived, she signed without ceremony. Her name looked foreign on the page. She carried the documents back through rooms that no longer remembered her. The living room where laughter once echoed, the kitchen where Daniel brewed coffee each morning, the bedroom where silence had grown louder than desire. One evening, as she lingered in the doorway of her empty apartment, a neighbor's child ran down the hall, laughter ricocheting off the walls with the unburdened joy only children could summon. The sound pierced her chest. She slid down the wall and sat on the cold floor, tears spilling unchecked. For the first time, she did not weep for what she lost or even for what she ruined. She wept for the version of herself that would never exist, the mother, the partner, the woman who might have lived a life unbroken by 3 hours of betrayal. The laughter faded. The silence remained. And Emily finally understood her reckoning had only just begun. Winter loosened its grip on Seattle slowly, like a hand reluctant to let go. The air by Green Lake was sharp but bearable, the kind that made every breath visible. Emily sat on a bench with palms pressed together, not in prayer, but to keep them from shaking. She had asked Daniel for 10 minutes. He agreed, but his punctuality felt like courtesy, not hope. He arrived without flourish. A gray coat, clean lines, no hesitation. He sat a measured distance away, respect and separation balanced in equal parts. For a moment they both watched a rower cut the lake into glassy slivers. Then Emily began. Her words were plain, nouns and verbs stripped of embroidery. She did not beg because begging would have been another lie. She told him she was sorry. She told him she had betrayed not only him, but the version of herself she once promised she would become beside him. There was no excuse, no scaffolding of explanation, only the blunt weight of truth. Daniel listened, the way he always had, silence making space for her voice. His expression did not change, though his eyes flicked once toward the water as if searching for a horizon beyond the shoreline. When she finished, the wind picked up, tugging at her scarf. He exhaled slowly, then thanked her not for the apology itself, but for not turning their divorce into spectacle, for not dragging him through theater that could destroy what dignity still remained. His tone was even but edged with finality. Then, almost as an afterthought, he explained the piano. He had kept it, he said, because he refused to let music become collateral. It was the one part of their life together he would not weaponize. Emily almost laughed, a jagged sound that died in her throat, because the tenderness of that reasoning ached worse than cruelty would have. They sat in silence heavy enough to count as dialogue. Geese crossed low over the water, their calls ragged in the cold. Daniel rose first. He put on his gloves, button by button, like rehearsing a ritual he had already repeated 1,000 times. Before leaving, he turned once more. "I hope you find a life," he said softly, "that doesn't rely on fire to feel warm." The words pierced her chest, not sharp with anger, but devastating in their truth. He meant them. That sincerity, that refusal to be petty, would keep her awake for a year. Because it proved the final, unalterable fact. His revenge was never in destruction. It was in refusal. He had chosen not to play the game that ruined her. Emily watched him walk away, his coat cutting a clean line against the lake's horizon. The world tilted. For the first time, she understood that survival could look like absence. and that sometimes the greatest victory was leaving someone else to live with the fire they started alone. The nonprofit's office smelled faintly of cardboard and burnt coffee, the kind of scent that lingers where resources are stretched thin, but intentions are abundant. Emily showed up twice a week, sleeves rolled without announcements. She unpacked donated laptops, logged serial numbers, installed basic programs. She tutored adults who had never touched a keyboard before, men laid off from warehouses, women who had raised children instead of resumes. She learned how to explain the simplest things, how to set up an email, how to spot a scam, how to reset a password without panic. When asked why she volunteered, she never spoke of restitution or penance or Daniel. She said only that the work matters, and in that repetition, this matters, she began stitching the edges of herself back together. At night, her apartment was quiet in a way that no longer mocked her. She boiled water, set tea bags in mugs she rarely drank, and sat at the cheap keyboard in the corner. Her fingers stumbled through the same blues progression Daniel once played, the notes uneven but hers. She learned where to pause, where to let silence carry weight. One evening she wrote a letter she would never send, not to Daniel, not to Ryan, to strangers she would never meet. She imagined someone like her, tempted to answer a late-night message from the past. She wrote plainly, that chaos dressed in romance is still chaos. That memory edits out the bruises and keeps only the heat, that 3 hours can steal a lifetime if you let them. She deleted every line that sounded like a plea. She left only the warning standing upright on its own. On the nonprofit's bulletin board, between flyers for coding classes and resume clinics, she pinned the letter anonymously. The words stared back at her, not a confession, not a cry for sympathy, but a lighthouse beam cast toward anyone drifting too close to familiar rocks. The piano she once dreamed of keeping was gone. In its place, a plastic keyboard hummed, brittle and thin, yet it was enough. She pressed the keys slowly, finding comfort in imperfection. Each note reminded her that music survives even in cheaper forms, that beauty doesn't vanish when conditions change, it reshapes. There was no redemption story waiting, no reunion, no dramatic forgiveness, no applause. There was only work, the daily practice of choosing oxygen over fire, of building exits before they were needed, of learning not to mistake quiet for absence, because sometimes quiet is restraint, and restraint is love choosing to leave the room with dignity. And so the story of 3 hours of betrayal destroyed everything. My husband found out the truth comes to an end. It wasn't rage, it wasn't chaos. Sometimes the most devastating revenge is silence and the choice to walk away with dignity. Betrayal always carries a price, and this story reminds us that trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. But what about you? If you were in Daniel's place, what would you have done? Confront her in anger, or leave quietly like he did? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching Cheating Stories 7. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your opinion below. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to life. Until next time, remember, betrayal can burn everything in hours, but resilience can last a lifetime.